I fully believe that we're not alone, and have for many, many years, even though, but at the time I went to the moon, it was a conventional wisdom, both in science and theology, that we were alone in the universe. We're just barely out of the trees, even though we think we're rather sophisticated. But I do like to tell the story that my great-grandparents came across from southern United States to the west after our Civil War. And I went to the moon less than 100 years later. They came across in covered wagons. So from covered wagons to going to the moon in less than 100 years in our lifetime is a rather significant event that tells us how primitive we have been until the modern era, and we're still rather primitive. Because of my openness to these things, I did have many of the old-timers in the military and in the intelligence community over the years wanting to get it off their chest before they passed away, allowed me to interview them and talk to them about it. And so my ideas became fairly well solidified in the fact we've been visited. We have to remember that right after World War II, the Army Air Force was separated and became the Air Force, a separate branch of service. And that the OSS, which was the Office of Special Services, was disbanded and eventually became the CIA. So that here was a major military organization and a major intelligence organization totally in disarray, new-founded, didn't know what they were doing after World War II, and not really reorganized yet. And as a result of that, the President Truman at that time convened a very high-level committee to examine this alien or UFO phenomenon. They did come to the conclusion that it was alien, and the military rightly came to the conclusion, if they're hostile, there's nothing we can do about it. Therefore, their choice was to deny it and to hush it up and create the National Security Act of 1947, which validated that deception and covered it up and allowed the group to go underground, as it were. And we've been living with that now for 50 years. It is really the beginning of the whole cover-up, the entire denial of this phenomenon, and the addition of dismissal, disinformation, misinformation to cloak and to discourage investigation, to misinform. It's just been continuous for many, many years now. Eventually it came away from the fear, I believe, of not being able to protect and do their duty to the notion of power and control, controlling the knowledge and the technology. And the group involved with that is still doing it. We have created our reality here, and we have created it right now rather badly, for it's not a sustainable reality. We have created, with our science and technology, instead of using it for the greater good, it's been captured by interest, greed, self-service, which is rife. And instead of using it, all of our technology and our brilliance and genius for greater good, we use it for self-service. And that's not going to work. It's important that we look at our civilization, our place in history, use our tools of science for greater understanding, to promote the greater good, and that's what it's all about.
There's another side to Cooper's lifetime in aviation, one that for years he would only discuss with close friends, until now. It involves his personal encounters with UFOs. For him, it began in 1951 while flying in Europe for the U.S. Air Force. There, Cooper and other pilots witnessed an incident that has never been officially explained. A vast armada of UFOs flying in formation at extremely high altitudes. Recently, Yolanda Gaskin spoke with Gordon Cooper. In this exclusive interview, Colonel Cooper spoke for the first time on television about his encounters with UFOs.
I've read about this incident you had in 1951, and you said you saw literally hundreds of unidentifiable flying objects.
Yes, they were flying quite high. How high we couldn't tell because we couldn't get anywhere near their altitude. But they were either very large craft way up or smaller craft still well above what we could get to.
For a day and a half, all of this happened. But then no one wanted to talk about it.
Well, we sent a report forward on it, and the answer that finally came back months later was they were probably high-flying seed pods, which didn't sound very logical.
There are always a lot of excuses. There's always the weather balloons. I've heard that one before. In 1951, you couldn't even get close to the things that were flying overhead. You or anyone else that was flying.
They were faster, higher.
6 years later, Cooper again encountered a UFO. This one definitely was not a weather balloon. While supervising flight testing at Edwards Air Force Base, his military camera crew actually filmed an unidentified saucer-shaped object landing near the site.
As they were sitting there filming, a little saucer came from, I say little saucer, it was a saucer, came flying over their heads, put down 3 little landing gear and landed right out on the dry lake bed. And they picked up their cameras and started over toward it, filming as they went. And when they got in fairly close to it, it lifted up, put the gear back in the wheel wells, tipped up, and took off at a great rate of speed. And so they came into my office and told me what had happened, and I sent them over to develop the film. And then had to go through all the proper regulations of reporting this, and we wound up having to send the film forward to Washington in the base jet airplane, and I don't know whether anyone's ever seen it since.
Now, the vehicle that you just described, how similar was it to the very first sighting that you had back in 1951?
Quite similar. It was basically the same plan-form vehicle. They were double saucer, lenticular. But if you're going to be going in and out of atmospheres like Earth or other places might have, you certainly need a little more aerodynamic type of vehicle. And the saucer has the capability of going through the air at tremendous rates of speed and handling the bow and trailing wave without making shock waves. So it can be very silent while traveling at big rates of speed through the atmosphere.
But sightings of UFOs weren't limited to the military. Cooper has commercial airline colleagues who've also seen UFOs.
Yes, a friend of mine who's a captain on a major airline at night was flying along, noticed this, suddenly a big glow came off his left wing, and he looked out and this big saucer was sitting right off their wing. And so he turned slide toward it and it moved away, and turned back and it moved back in position, and turned to his co-pilot and said, do you see what I see? And he said, oh God, yeah, I do. And it trailed along with him for quite a period of time, then tipped up, climbed very steeply away. Was on Jim McDivitt's Gemini 7 mission, where they saw this glint of something metallic off in the distance. And he reported, and nobody had it listed on the ground, so he tried getting a picture of it, but the sun, unfortunately, was glinting off of it so bright. All you got is just a glint. There was no detail on what it was, but never any further sighting at all on it.
Years later, Cooper approached the United Nations with a proposal for a committee that would explore the UFO phenomenon.
All right, now tell me about the letter to the UN.
Well, the letter to the UN was in conjunction with a meeting that I had with Kurt Waldheim and the Security Council of the UN to try to encourage the UN to establish a committee to start comparing notes and data and information, and to really look into all of this from an unbiased, neutral point of view.
Here's a quote from your letter. I believe that these extraterrestrial vehicles and their crews are visiting this planet from other planets and are obviously a little more advanced than we are here on Earth. And are you saying that's exactly why governments have been trying to keep this information private, because of that obvious advancement?
Very possibly, right.
When people first read the Allies of Humanity briefings, often they're very confused, because the reality of life in the universe that it's revealing to us is very different than what we may have expected, or what we think to be true. As a people, we have been conditioned to think of life in the universe largely based upon our films, our movies. Star Wars, Star Trek, War of the Worlds. And we think of the universe here as demonstrating our own values and level of consciousness. We imagine nations blowing each other up. We imagine huge empires and great wars. But the reality of life in the universe is actually very different. And sometimes that's confounding to people who read the Allies of Humanity for the first time. For the briefings themselves require that we reconsider our expectations, our assumptions, and perhaps even our myths about the reality of life in the universe, and what contact with humanity would really mean, and what it would really look like. For example, humanity thinks, or people tend to think, that we're very important in the universe, as if we're the center of God's creation, and that whoever would come here to benefit us, to give us gifts, to provide us technology or reveal higher levels of science, as if the universe existed to serve us in some way. We assume our significance here, but fail to see that other races would come here for their own purposes, which might not include our welfare at all. Another common idea that people have is that if a visiting race is not destroying us or attacking us, then they must be benign or beneficial, and that we should not fear them or be wary concerning them. The Allies of Humanity briefings reveal to us, however, that we're dealing with resource explorers, economic groups, groups seeking resources and alliances, seeking to position themselves within this conflicted world and to take advantage of a divided and contentious humanity. So naturally, they're not destroying us because we're part of the resource that they need. They're not destroying the world because the biological diversity of this world represents its fundamental wealth. They do not have weapons of mass destruction, and so they're seeking to gain their advantage here through other means, primarily through the power of persuasion, inducement, and intimidation. The Allies of Humanity briefings reveal to us that war and conflict in this part of the universe has been suppressed. It has been suppressed by older societies that have established long-standing networks of trade. And these networks of trade and the many nations that are involved with them suppress conflict and war between worlds. So actually war in our part of space is very rare. Yet what is also rare is freedom and free societies. And those races who are in the world today interfering with human affairs represent races that are seeking for advantage here. They will take advantage of our ignorance, they will take advantage of our conflicts, and they will take advantage of our superstitions, our expectations, our hopes, our fears. Because we really don't understand their nature and their purpose in being here, we then ascribe to that our own values and our own wishful thinking. So we hope and expect that all who would visit us would be here for our benefit. But that's a child's view of the universe. Think of the young adolescents entering the big city for the first time, expecting to meet wonderful people at every turn, expecting to be treated with respect and true accord, and finding out through tribulation or through personal failure that the reality is actually very different. We're risking now making critical mistakes in our decisions and in our perception of those races who are visiting the world today. We're making them for obvious reasons, But we're also making them because we're ignorant and we do not understand what we're dealing with yet. But one of the important things about the Allies of Humanity briefings is that the reality that it gives us about life in the universe is something we can understand. We know what competition is like between nations. We know what persuasion means and how it can be manifested. We know what deception is. We know from our own history how powerful nations have gained advantage with weaker nations without the use of force. By inducing those nations to become reliant upon technology from beyond their sphere of influence, bringing them into the world community, often to their great disadvantage, robbing them of their own leadership, their own religious traditions, bespoiling their cultures and so forth. Now we're facing competition from the universe. And we're facing many of the same kinds of activities and deceptions that we exercise here on Earth. So the reality of the intervention is not a mystery. It's actually a demonstration of nature. Competition and intervention are part of nature. Competition for environment, competition for resources. These are all part of the natural world. This is going on all the time at every imaginable level of life as we know it. But now we're in a different position. Instead of being the preeminent race in this world, we're facing competition from others whom we do not understand. We're facing intervention by races who want to remain secret, carry on their activities without human awareness or approval. And we do not realize the danger this poses to humanity's future and freedom. The Allies of Humanity briefings tell us what humanity will need to know and do in order to build human freedom and to secure it within this greater community of intelligent life into which we are now emerging. And it reveals to us, in terms we can clearly understand, what life is like and the competitive nature of life in the universe, and the skills that we must bring to bear to be able to function within this larger arena of intelligent life. For we're now the beginners in a great education, and this education cannot be provided by anyone here on Earth. It can only come from two sources. It either comes from God, or it comes from those races who could be beneficial to us in the future. This education is vital for our future and our destiny as a free race in the universe. We neglect it at our own peril. It comes to us in a form that is simple, clear, and understandable, and unambiguous. But to provide a message of this clarity, it necessarily must dispel our assumptions, our beliefs, and our expectations that are really out of accord with reality and with life as it truly exists. Here the briefings are challenging us, but also encouraging us to recognize that we have the power and the responsibility as the peoples of this world to establish our own rules of engagement, to set boundaries for other races visiting our world, and to be vigilant for any kind of visitation or intervention that may occur in the future and that is already happening in our world today.
About 3 days and 200,000 miles into the flight, Mission Control did miss the significance of a cryptic message from the astronauts.
Do you have any idea where the employee is with respect to us? Stand by.
The crew required information on the current position of the S-4B, the final stage of the rocket which had been jettisoned away 2 days earlier. This short message hid an extraordinary turn of events. Apollo 11 wasn't alone in space.
There was something out there that was close enough to be observed, and what could it be?
Traveling alongside Apollo 11 was a mysterious object, like this one filmed on a later mission. If the object wasn't part of Apollo's rocket, it could be only one thing: a UFO.
Mike decided he thought he could see it in the telescope, and he was able to do that. And when it was in one position, that it had a series of ellipses. But when you made it real sharp, it was sort of L-shaped. That didn't tell us very much.
NASA knew very little about the object reported by the Apollo 11 crew. It was obviously an unidentified flying object, but such objects were not uncommon, and the history of even Earth orbit space flights going back over the previous years indicated that several crews saw objects.
Despite having a clear view of the UFO, the crew were wary of reporting it to Mission Control.
Now, obviously, the three of us were not going to blurt out, "Hey, Houston, we got something moving alongside of us, and we don't know what it is. You know, can you tell us what it is?" We weren't about to do that, because we know that those transmissions would be heard by all sorts of people, and who knows what somebody would have demanded that we turn back because of aliens or whatever the reason is. So we didn't do that, but we did decide we just cautiously ask Houston, how far away was the S4B?
Unaware of the drama unfolding in space, Mission Control radioed the position back to Apollo 11.
Apollo 11, Houston, the S4B is about 6,000 nautical miles from you now, over.
And a few moments later, they came back and said something like it was 6,000 miles away because of the maneuver. So we really didn't think we were looking at something that far away. So we decided that after a while of watching it, it was time to go to sleep and not to talk about it anymore until we came back and debriefing.
To this day, whatever it was the crew saw has never been positively identified or officially acknowledged.
The possibility that you might encounter aliens in space has to be considered in a very sensible and positive and realistic way. There were a lot of people within the program who went off later and became convinced that UFOs existed. And that led to some concern on NASA's part, where they got the agreement of the crew never to publicly talk about these things for fear of ridicule.
There are many species, and I'm convinced they have different agendas. Just like maybe the United States, Russia, China might have different agendas. So if you say, well, what do Earthlings think? Well, who are you talking about? Are you talking about the Russians or the Americans or the Germans or who? And I think there have been face-to-face meetings, probably with species who look very much like humans. And some of them come from planets in our own solar system. And they are people who could be walking down the corridors of the Pentagon and would be unrecognized. Then there are other species, such as the Greys, for example, which are very distinct in their looks. They're short, they have very large heads, very long arms, and very big eyes. And they're more like the ones that we usually see in the cartoons of extraterrestrials. They're not little green men, which we used to say, little green men from Mars, but they're short, dark-skinned, what they were designated as by the United States government, extraterrestrial biological entities, EBs. So the EBs, that group of them, look very different. And they may have an agenda which is quite different from some of the others, because there are different degrees of spirituality. And in the meantime, the MJ-12, this is the very small elite group that President Truman set up to manage the extraterrestrial file and to report directly to the president. They allegedly made a deal with the Greys to exchange technology and to allow them to do a limited number. That's a joke to say, you know, but the deal was a limited number of abductions in exchange for technology. And that as a result of this arrangement, over the years, the United States has managed to what we call back engineer or replicate the extraterrestrial technology, both on the weapons side and on the transportation side, to the point where Dr. Stephen Greer's witnesses said about the flying saucers, you can't tell whether it's one of theirs or one of ours because they look so much alike. So they have made tremendous progress in 60 years, and they have developed very powerful weapons, far more powerful than anything they had before. And they have, according to Ben Rich, who was the former head of the Lockheed Skunk Works, which was working on these kinds of vehicles, they now have, as he said, quote, the capability of taking E.T. home. And so when you say happiness, I think you have to then say happiness between whom and by whom, because there's no carte blanche single answer to that question. I know that there is some concern about one breed of reptilians, and that maybe they have some connection with the Greys, I don't know. But again, you can't, it's not carte blanche, because there are branches of the reptilians, and there are allegedly some good, positive creatures in this with that name. But the United States, when it was briefing presidents, has always said that most of them are benign, but there was one that wasn't. They've never named the one. No one's ever told me who it was. But I suspect they're talking about this one branch of the reptilians, who, if you wanted a nice way to sum it up, would represent the dark. And on the other hand, the people from Mars and Venus and Saturn, who look more like us, are more spiritual, and who would represent the light. So it's not an easy question, no definitive answer, because I don't know precisely what the answer is. I suspect no one knows 100%. When I say no one, I mean no human in the realm of authority. But there are certainly people in the United States cabal who have more information about this subject than any of the rest of us, because they have been collecting it assiduously for years and years, and they have probably had more contact with different groups over a longer period than just about anybody else. So they have a lot to disclose when we can get them to disclose it. But disclosure is essential. The information is there. It's in the public domain. But the cabal owns so much of the press, both print and electronic, that it's not going to get into the press that would convince him, like his own paper. And that is a problem.
Lie out there deep in space. Do you want to believe we're not alone, that somewhere in the universe intelligent life may actually exist?
Our next guest says there is life out there. It does exist. Dr. Charles Hall says he spent 2 years working with extraterrestrial beings during his time with the American military. He claims the US military has actually been in contact with alien species for years. And Dr. Charles Hall is here to explain, along with his wife Marie, live from what Bugs Bunny used to call Albuquerque, New Mexico. Now, thank you both for your time. Terrific to have you with us. Firstly, Charles, can you tell us your story of how you managed to come into contact with these beings as you worked with the military?
I'm a Vietnam veteran, and I enlisted in the Air Force in July 1964, and I was trained as a weather observer. And I was sent to Nellis Air Force Base, Nevada, outside Las Vegas, Nevada. And for 2.5 years, I was sent up to the gunnery ranges up at Indian Springs, and I was given a clearance to allow me to go anywhere in Dreamland as long as I was alone. I discovered that up there at the north end of Indian Springs Valley, which you can see on the map in the state of Nevada here in America, that there was a base which the U.S. Air Force maintained for a group of extraterrestrials who were tall and white. And I, as the duty weather observer, was allowed to go up there, or they were allowed to come down to where I was. And the interaction took place over more than 2 years.
Wow.
During those 2 years, I also came across, I also interacted to a lesser extent with the Roswell Greys, and I've also personally talked with the extraterrestrials that I call the Norwegians with 24 teeth, who come here from a very nearby star, perhaps Bernard star. And my experiences, my presentations, my books are unique because I'm the only person that I know of that was allowed to interact with the extraterrestrials, the tall whites, for more than 2 years.
So 3 different species of aliens you're talking about there, Charles?
Yeah, can you describe what they look like, what they were like?
Well, I'll start with the tall whites. They're thinner than we are, and they're very frail. Throughout most of their life, they are the same height as I am, 5'11", but they live 10 times longer than humans. They live 600 or 800 years.
Wow.
But they don't age the way we do. When they get to be equivalent to a human of about 40 years, that means when they're about 400 years, they start growing again instead of aging as humans.
Right.
And then they go, and this continues, and so that by the time they get to be 600 or 800 years old, they're very tall, 8.5, 9, or 10 feet tall. But this is not necessarily good because their skeleton grows more than their internal organs. And so there comes a time after 600 or 800 years when their skeleton, their body is tall, but their organs can't support it. At which time they die a natural death, because they're just flesh and blood creatures like we are. If they injure themselves, it takes them 10 times longer to heal up than a human.
Yeah.
So there's a trade-off.
Yeah, right. They still look fresh as a daisy when they go, though. They look like Tilda Swinton. Hey, just quickly, you had them there. You were working with the aliens on any particular project, or was the military working with the aliens on a particular project? Was there, I don't know, technology sharing or, you know, botanical cross-fertilization?
The U.S. Air Force, and I'm speaking of the mid-1960s, was willing to give them anything they asked for. When I first met them, I was very afraid of them, and every human I met when you come across them out in the desert was naturally very afraid of them, and they were even more afraid of us. It's like running into a gorilla in the wild where the gorilla is on his home ground. So they had to go through a process of becoming used to being around humans before they could take part in the technology transfer program. I, as the weather observer, was the test human. As an enlisted man, I was expendable. You know, I was the one they send out to and say, practice talking to Charlie. And
Marie, let's bring you in. You've never seen these things for yourself. Are you a believer? Because probably a lot of people watching this morning are going to think, I don't believe him. It's ridiculous. How could it be possible?
Well, Charles was very intelligent in that he waited until we'd been married a couple of months before he told me about the extraterrestrials coming into his barracks at night. And he said, well, what do you think? And I said, I really don't care. I have never given any thought as to whether they exist or not, and I really don't care. I've known Charles. We've been married over 43 years. He may be a character, but I am his character reference, and I totally believe that this is real. Furthermore, we have had confirmations from people all over the world. We have never had any serious tire kickers, you know, people who say, well...
Well, certainly there seems to be a lot of people, around the world who would support your view on this, who seem to have had their own experiences, but probably not quite as intimately as you. Now, unfortunately, we are going to have to leave it there, Charles and Marie, because we're about to lose our satellite, but you're coming to Australia next week to give a series of talks, and we can't wait to see you. And all the details of your tour will be on our website, so those interested in the life beyond will no doubt be there.
Абсолютно все. Ну вот, например, прилетали на Землю инопланетяне, вот самые зеленые человечки.
Значит, рассказываю вам первый и последний раз. Вместе с передачей чемодана с ядерными кодами президенту страны приносят специальную папку. На ней написано «Совершенно секретно». И она целиком и полностью посвящена пришельцам, которые посетили нашу планету. Одновременно предоставляется доклад от абсолютно закрытой спецслужбы, которая занимается контролем пришельцев на территории нашей страны. Значит, две эти папки передаются вместе с ядерным чемоданом. После прекращения полномочий, соответственно, эти папки передаются новому президенту. Более подробную информацию на эту тему вы можете получить, посмотрев известный хроникально-документальный фильм «Люди в черном». Вышло несколько версий.
Сколько их среди нас?
Сколько их среди нас, рассказывать не буду, потому что это может вызвать панику.